Morning Year 10, here is lesson number 5 on an inspector course. These will all be automatically loaded up to my YouTube channel, and I will email the links on class charts and Office 365, but I highly suggest that you subscribe to the YouTube channel because then you've got it saved and you can just check systematically whether a new video has been uploaded. Okay, so today we're going to summarise what Mr Birling did to Eva Smith and how this develops our opinion of him. Now, just to recap on the story, Eva Smith is the name of a girl, a working class girl, who committed suicide through drinking disinfectant, which is an incredibly gruesome, horrendous way to die. And we know that Inspector Gould, a policeman, has come to the Birling house to ask them some questions. And he has begun by questioning Mr Birling. So today we're going to read that bit of the play. We're going to find out specifically what Mr Birling did. How does that develop our impression of him? And why does Priestley want us to have that impression? So as always, we'll start with our vocabulary. Our old word, back when we were studying A Christmas Carol, is impoverished. So what class would the impoverished belong to? It's a nice easy question. If you want to extend your answer, you could bullet point some notes about what life would be like for the impoverished. So you can pause the video and answer that. And our new word today is callous. Now, if someone's callous, they show an insensitive and cruel disregard for others. So they really don't care about other people. So how is Scrooge presented as callous? So think back to our work on A Christmas Carol. How is Scrooge presented as a callous character? So again, pause the video and give yourself a chance to answer those questions. So if you are impoverished, then you live in poverty, and obviously the working class or the poor would be impoverished, particularly the poor. Now remember, the working class are those who are in non-skilled professions, paid a very low wage, whereas the poor are those that are completely destitute. They are those who are prostitutes, criminals, homeless, and their situation is even worse than the working class. So, callous then, how is Scrooge presented as callous? He doesn't care about anyone other than himself. He describes the poor as the surplus population, so he thinks they should just die, less mouths to feed. He is horrible to his own family, to Fred. He rejects him and his Christmas dinner invitation. He's horrible to the carol singer boy. He rejects Belle, his fiancée. He is horrible to the Cratchit, to Mr Cratchit, and pays him a low wage. So at the start, Scrooge is an incredibly callous character. So we are going to go back to our copies of An Inspector Calls then. And we are just going to continue to annotate it. So we got to the point where the inspector is questioning Mr Birling. So the inspector says, "I think you remember Eva Smith now, don't you, Mr Birling?" So he speaks to him very forcefully. And Birling says, "Yes, I do. She was one of my employees, and then I discharged her." So discharged means he fired her. So she worked in one of his factories and then he fired her. And Eric says, "Is that why she committed suicide? When was this, father?" Now he seems concerned about this girl, which again is surprising considering who his family is. Birling says, "Just keep quiet, Eric, and don't get excited." He speaks to Eric like he's a child. Which is interesting considering Eric is his heir and Eric is in his 20s, but he's very patronising towards him. "This girl left us nearly 2 years ago. Let me see, it must have been the early autumn of 1910. Okay, so I would write down in your exercise books or whatever it is you're writing on, early autumn 1910. Mr Birling fires Eva Smith, because we'll begin to come up with a timeline of events. Okay, so it was the early autumn of 1910 that Mr Birling fires Eva Smith, and that, as we see, begins her whole journey, really, in what happens to her in this play. The inspector says, yes, end of September 1910. And Birling agrees, that's right. And Gerald says, look here, sir, wouldn't you rather I was out of this? Now this is Gerald's aristocratic upbringing come into it. He doesn't want to be embarrassed. You know, he'd rather be ignorant, which is interesting. If Mr Birling's done anything wrong, he doesn't care, he just doesn't want to know about it. So it's very hypocritical, really. But Birling says, I don't mind you being here, Gerald, and I'm sure you've no objection, have you, Inspector? Perhaps I ought to explain first that this is Mr Gerald Croft, the son of Sir George Croft, you know, Crofts Limited. So yet again, Mr Birling is referring to the status of himself, but now Gerald. So he's using Gerald's status to try to intimidate the inspector. But it doesn't really work. The inspector says, Mr Gerald Croft, eh? Birling says, yes, incidentally, we've been modestly celebrating his engagement to my daughter, Sheila. So we can see how proud Mr Birling is of this. And the inspector says, I see. Mr Croft is going to marry Miss Sheila Birling. Gerald, smiling, says, I hope so. The inspector gravely, then I prefer you stay. So gravely means seriously. So again, we've got foreshadowing. Sorry, I can't write this morning. Foreshadowing, more of them are involved. Gerald, surprised, says, oh, all right. Now Birling's getting impatient now, which is interesting. He's losing his patience. He's beginning to get annoyed. Look, there's nothing mysterious or scandalous about this business. Now, this word scandalous is really important. A scandal would be this idea of, you know, public humiliation. When you are rich or wealthy or have a high status, like Mr Birling does, your reputation, what others think of you, is incredibly important. So a scandal, this all coming out publicly, would be the last thing Mr Birling would want, because remember, it's all about appearances and it's all about looking good. So there's nothing mysterious or scandalous about this business, at least not so far as I'm concerned. It's a perfectly straightforward case, and as it happened more than 18 months ago, nearly 2 years ago, obviously it has nothing whatever to do with the wretched girl's suicide. Inspector? So even now, he's accepting no responsibility. He doesn't see how his actions, firing a working class girl, could have led to suicide. He's so ignorant. The inspector says, no, sir, I can't agree with you there. So again, it's showing that the inspector isn't intimidated by Mr Birling. Okay, he's not intimidated by Mr Birling. Okay, he is very much happy to disagree with him, which would be quite unusual in a police inspector, being that they're a lower status. So Birling says, why not? The inspector replies, because what happened to her then may have determined what happened to her afterwards, and what happened to her afterwards may have driven her to suicide. A chain of events. Now this is really important because it is a chain of events. A chain of events that Mr Birling started by firing her. Well, Birling says, oh well, put it like that, and there's something in what you say. Still, I can't accept any responsibility. If we were all responsible for everything that happened to everybody we'd had anything to do with, it would be very awkward, wouldn't it? So again, this is Mr Birling, you know, showing a capitalist view. We can't accept responsibility for everything we've ever done to anyone. That would be very awkward, that would be very difficult. So when the inspector says very awkward, he's being ironic or sarcastic, because we know he is a socialist, and actually this idea of we are all responsible for what happens to each other is one of the main principles of socialism. Birling says, we'd all be in an impossible position, wouldn't we? And Eric says, by Jove, yes. And as you were saying, Dad, a man has to look after himself. So he's repeating Mr Birling's previous speech. Now this is important because it shows how Eric has almost been indoctrinated with his father's ideology, his father's views. Eric, again, doesn't know any different. He's been totally surrounded by that class his whole life. So he believes what his father believes. However, we have seen glimmers of hope from Eric that actually he could change his ways. He is more empathetic than his father. Now Birling says, yes, well, we needn't go into that. Now, interestingly, he doesn't want the inspector to know. Which would hint that a tiny bit of him is, I sort of mean ashamed, but not really. Ashamed that he wouldn't want other people to know he has those views, because he recognises deep down there's something wrong with them, but he still thinks he's in the right. The inspector says, go into what? And Birling says, oh, just before you came, I'd been giving these young men a little good advice. So again, very patronising, he thinks he knows everything. Now, about this girl, Eva Smith, I remember her quite well now. She was a lively, good-looking girl, country-bred, I fancy. Every single character that talks about Eva Smith talks about the fact that she is attractive. Because again, it's a misogynistic view. The only thing that really matters about a woman is her appearance. She'd been working in one of our machine shops for over a year. A good worker too. In fact, the foreman there told me he was ready to promote her into what they call a leading operator, head of a small group of girls. But after they came back from their holidays that August, they were all rather restless and suddenly decided to ask for more money. They were averaging about 22 and 6, which was neither more nor less than what is paid generally in our industry. They wanted the rates raised so that they could average about 25 shillings a week. I refused, of course. So Eva and the workers wanted a small raise. Now we need to remember that what Birling would have paid them would be the bare minimum he can get away with paying, because if he had to pay them more money, then that would affect his profits. And as a capitalist, he's all about his own individual gain, even if it means exploiting people like Eva Smith and the other girls. So the inspector says, why? Now Birling is surprised by this. Did you say why? And the inspector says, yes. Why did you refuse? Now Mr Birling takes offence to that, really. Well, Inspector, I don't see that it's any concern of yours how I choose to run my business, is it now? And the inspector says, it might be, you know. Birling says, I don't like that tone. The inspector says, I'm sorry, but you asked me a question. And Birling says, and you asked me a question before that, a quite unnecessary question too. The inspector says, it's my duty to ask questions. Well, it's my duty to keep labour costs down. Now, what we have throughout this whole little bit here is this is all a power play. Okay, it is a power play between the inspector and Mr Birling. Mr Birling would have expected the inspector to very much look up to him, to treat him with the respect that he feels his status deserves. But the inspector's doing the opposite. He is questioning him and treating him just like any other person. So throughout all of this, we see the inspector refuse to be intimidated by Mr Birling, and Mr Birling taking quite a lot of offence, really, that the inspector dares to question him. So, you know, it's my duty to keep labour costs down. Again, this is a capitalist ideology. Remember, ideology just means sort of belief. And if I agreed to this demand for a new rate, it would have added about 12% to our labour costs. So Mr Birling would have made less profit. And that's all he cares about. Does that satisfy you? So I refused, said I couldn't consider it. We were paying the usual rates, and if they didn't like those rates, they could go and work somewhere else. It's a free country, I told them. Because again, there will be hundreds of girls wanting work. Mr Birling will never have to struggle to get employees to work in his factory. So he can say, oh, well, if you don't like it, go away then. There's hundreds of you. He doesn't view these workers as people. They're just, you know, cogs in the machine of his factory to give him profits. Now, this is really significant because Eric says it isn't if you can't go and work somewhere else. And the inspector agrees. So Eric is more sympathetic. And we've seen several times now Eric have a more open-minded attitude than his father. And the inspector, a socialist, agrees with him. Birling says to Eric, look, you just keep out of this. You hadn't even started in the works when this happened. So they went on strike. That didn't last long, of course. So they refused to go to work until they got paid the money. Gerald says, not if it was just after all the holidays. They'd all be broke if I knew them. So we need to remember, Mom. Gerald is just like Mr Birling.
Mom, my mum's taking off your paper on my drink.
Okay, Gerald is just like Mr Birling.
Mom.
He just views these girls as numbers rather than people too. Right, Gerald, they mostly were, and so was the strike after a week or two. Pitiful affair, so he really looks down on them. Well, we let them all come back at the old rates, so they were forced to go back to work and they just had to keep on getting paid the same, except the 4 or 5 ringleaders who'd started the trouble. I went down and told them to clear out. I went down myself and told them to clear out. And this girl, this Eva Smith, was one of them. She'd had a lot to say, far too much, so she had to go. Now again, God forbid a woman, let alone a working class woman, has something to say to Mr Birling. Okay, like children, women should be seen and not heard and be obedient. So he fires Eva Smith for starting the strike. Gerald says, you couldn't have done anything else. So he agrees, yet again, fellow capitalist. Eric disagrees. He could have kept her on instead of throwing her out. I call it tough luck. Now, interestingly, Eric would have let her stay. Not raise their wages, interestingly, not yet anyway, but he would have let her stay. And Birling says, rubbish. If you don't come down sharply on some of these people, they'll soon be asking for the earth. So he's almost saying, you've got to set an example. You know, the rich rule, the poor don't. So he's like, if you start giving them money, then maybe they'll want better working conditions, etc., etc. You can't let them think they've got any power. And again, Gerald, I should say so. It's just as bad as Mr Birling. He agrees. But the inspector, as a socialist, says they might, but after all, it's better to ask for the earth than to take it. So here we have an implied criticism of capitalists like Mr Birling. They just take what they want and give nothing back to society. So Birling staring at the inspector. Yeah, the inspector's so the inspector has finally made him really cross. What did you say your name was, Inspector? Goole. Goole. Birling says, how'd you get on with our Chief Constable, Colonel Roberts? So, this is the inspector's boss. The inspector says, I don't see much of him. And Birling says, perhaps I ought to warn you that he's an old friend of mine and that I see him fairly frequently. We play golf together sometimes up at the West Brumley. So he's threatening, outright threatening, the inspector. Again with his status, I am friends with your boss. If you don't stop the way you are speaking to me and my family, I will get you fired. So he's throwing his weight around here. But the inspector, yet again, isn't intimidated. Dryly, I don't play golf. Birling says, I didn't suppose you did. Eric, bursting out, well, I think it's a damn shame. The inspector, misunderstanding him, says, no, I've never wanted to play. And Eric says, no, about this girl, this Eva Smith. Why shouldn't they try for higher wages? We try for the highest possible prices. And I don't see why she should have been sacked just because she had a bit more spirit than the others. You said yourself she was a good worker. I'd have let her slay. So again, he's more sympathetic.
Can I have ice cream in a minute?
No, you can't have an ice cream right now.
I said, please can I have ice cream in a minute?
Maybe in a minute.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm getting interrupted by hounded for ice cream, which my son seems to think is appropriate breakfast food at 9:30. So he's more sympathetic than his father. He thinks, well, why shouldn't they pay for higher wages? Why shouldn't they try and get higher wages? We care about getting the higher prices. So he would have made a different decision to his father. But this makes Mr Birling angry. He doesn't like the fact that his son isn't supporting him and is disagreeing. Unless you brighten your ideas, you'll never be in a position to let anybody stay or to tell anybody to go. So again, he's threatening Eric now. You know, Mr Birling doesn't have to give him the company. He could, choose to give it to somebody else. So he's threatening Eric, well, if you don't change your views, then you'll never inherit the company. It's about time you learn to face a few responsibilities. Now, this is very ironic because it's Mr Birling, that isn't accepting responsibility for what he did to Eva Smith. That's something this public school and varsity life you've had doesn't seem to teach you. So again, that's just going back to, Eric's privilege that he would have had. Okay? So Eric, sulkily, like a child, like my son, if I probably tell him he's not allowed ice cream. Okay, sulkily, well, we don't need to tell the inspector all about that, do we? Birling says, I don't see we need to tell the inspector anything more. In fact, there's nothing I can tell him. I told the girl to clear out and she went. That's the last I heard of her. Have you any idea what happened to her after that? Get into trouble, go on the streets. He doesn't even care that he could have forced this girl onto the streets. And the inspector says rather slowly, no, she didn't exactly go on the streets. Okay, so we're going to stop there. Now, because that was quite a lot to annotate, we're just going to answer or do 3 short tasks, okay? So write a summary of what Mr Birling did to Eva Smith. Okay, so how did he know her? What did he do to her? Does he accept any responsibility? Then write me a few sentences about how this develops your impression of his character. And then a couple of sentences on why do you think Priestley chose to present Mr Birling in this way. Think about the fact that Mr Birling represents capitalism. Think about the fact that as a socialist, what did Priestley want us to think about Mr Birling, and link that all into his intentions of using this play to promote socialist ideology and to convert us from capitalism to socialism. Okay, and then email your class teacher your answer to those 3 bullet points. Okay, have a very lovely weekend. I hope your first week in isolation has been okay and that you are adjusting. I just wanted to say, please don't get in a panic if you have just discovered these lessons or haven't been able to access Office 365 or class charts until now. Every day I'm getting more and more people contact me, which is really, really good. So the last thing I want any of you to do is to get in a panic. Okay, I'm doing these lessons daily to keep us on track, so when we come back, we're not behind. But if you need to do some catching up at some point, then it really doesn't matter. Okay, so the last thing anybody needs is more stress. And as always, if you need any help, any support, let me know. Okay, goodbye.